to the second paper in this panel of Heterodox Classics, part of the Heterodox Academy. Now, just to recap, this panel, the first paper of which is by my colleague James Kierstead, was due to take place at the Classical Association Conference in Swansea this year in 2020, but unfortunately due to COVID-19 that did not take place. So instead we are putting these videos online for you to enjoy at home. And just a reminder as well of the aims of Heterodox Classics and the overall Heterodox Academy. They are to promote the basic values of freedom of speech, free discussion, debate, and diversity of opinion. And if, for a classicist, if you're wanting to begin a discussion on freedom of speech, where better to start than the picture on the screen, which is, of course, I'm sure you recognized it, ancient Athens. That what you can see there is the Acropolis, the ancient citadel, and the Parthenon, one of the greatest memorials and part of the legacy of that great flowering of architecture and art and intellectual thought and democracy, which appeared in ancient Athens during the 5th and 4th centuries BC. Now, what I'd like to suggest to you is that we can actually learn a great deal from the ancient Greeks and Romans about many things, but particularly about how to live in a political community, and a community that is a democracy that does promote freedom of speech, what the ancient Athenians called parrhesia, literally all speech. And if we want to think or find a model, or I think of in many ways ideal behavior within such a community, I would like to suggest to you Socrates, the famous philosopher, son of Sophroniscus, who of course many of you will know for his philosophical doctrines, but also the way he lived his life, a life of great integrity and a life of great moral courage, someone who was always intent only on seeking the truth and never prepared to tell a lie or commit an injustice. And I think this was not just a theoretical doctrine, this was how he actually lived his life, including his great act, one particular great act of moral courage in a political setting, was when he was a member of the council, the executive body of the Athenian state, and an illegal and unconstitutional motion was put before that body to try to vote, to execute 6 generals without really any trial at all, who had taken part in the Battle of Arginusae in 406 BC. And Socrates said no. He was the only one to say this is illegal, this is unconstitutional, and I will not act against the laws. And I think this is an example of freedom of speech and a devotion to truth in action in a political state, in a democracy. However, my topic of conversation here today is not generally on politics, but on a particular area within such a community, of a polis, of a state. And this is work. Now, many of you may not think of work as being particularly political. I hope I can change your mind throughout the course of this morning. What I want to look at is not just work in general, but professionalism and the professions. Now, these have been widely studied in modern history and in sociology. I've put some titles that you can look at up on the screen. And the key points to take from a lot of these studies is that there exists in most societies, and probably in fact in all societies, a group of individuals who have a special status. Now, this status comes from their knowledge, their skill. And knowledge and skill, the practice of knowledge and skill, gives them a special identity, a collegial focus, a collegial identity in as practitioners, as providers of a beneficial service to the community. And this defines their purpose within that community, and they gain often accrue to themselves special privileges as well, and honours, and even sheltered markets. So we're thinking, for example, of the guilds of medieval and early modern Europe, for example. That is professionalism and the professions. Now, there's been very little study, very few studies of the professions, or what one might call the professions, in the ancient world until now. And here comes the shameless plug for the recently, or very recently, published volume, Skilled Labour and Professionalism in Ancient Greece and Rome, edited by yours truly, myself, and Edward Harris and David Lewis. And in that volume, we attempt to argue that actually skill plays a very important role in the ancient economy, a much bigger role than is often supposed. But more than that, it plays an important role in organizing society. Society was not simply just two homogeneous groups, the mass and the elite, the smaller elite dominating over the massive homogeneous peasant mass. No, we actually argue that skill and knowledge and talent in a particular profession was a very important method, a very important route of social mobility, and a source of status in its own right. So that the professionals, the technitai, form a much neglected but important social category within the ancient state. Now, the question I'd like to raise here today, though, because I don't have time to go into outline that research in great detail, but the question I'd like to focus on is, can the Greek concept of skill, and the word here, the most important Greek word here, is techner, from which, of course, we derive our cognates, technology, technical, etc., etc., help us to understand and provide a new light on the modern workplace and the workings of modern professions. Now, I'm not the first person to have considered this, I hasten to add, and I would point you in particular to Hoffman's 2003 article, the reference is on the screen there, where he argues, and this is very much someone who's interested in modern medical professionalism, but he argues that this ancient concept of techne can have important consequences for how we view modern medical practice. And in what follows, I'm very much echoing what Hoffman says, but I'll also hopefully have a look at one particular ancient text and maybe demonstrate a way in which this idea can be useful. So, let's have a think now about the ancient concept of techne, of professional skill. Why is it useful today? Well, I think what is helpful with the idea of techne is that all forms of skill, all forms of techne, are defined as practices which have a particular function, and by performing that function, they provide a service, they provide a good, a benefit for society. So the ancient term for functional deed is ergon, and good benefit is agathon. And each techne specializes in a particular ergon, so it has only one focus. And that is, for example, if we're talking about medicine, the focus, the ergon, the function of medicine is health. The Greeks would say hygieia. So why is this idea important? I think it helps us to clarify certain things. It helps to provide focus to our work within professions today. One important significance is that if we can show that the particular practice that we're carrying out is a techne, and is therefore something which has a function and provides a good service to society. And this may be in doubt, of course. For example, is working in the casino, let's say, a techne? Is it a profession? Does it provide a public good? Well, maybe we would say no. But let's take the example of, say, a classics professor. I think we can argue that this is skilled work which does provide benefit. And if we can make that argument, then we can be confident that if we are doing the work of fulfilling the function, the ergon, of a classics professor, of a classics lecturer in higher education, then we are doing something that is good. Now, it may be a very small good. Arguably, the good that comes from teaching classics is perhaps much less good than being a brain surgeon, for example. We may need more brain surgeons. We may need to pay them more. I would not want to argue against that at any length. But the point is that both the classics professor and the brain surgeon are performing a distinct specialist ergon, which is useful. So they are both of value in themselves. Maybe one is more valuable than the other. And by keeping this in mind, I think this may help us to focus our work more closely. We can ask ourselves, whenever we're asked to do a particular job, we can ask ourselves, well, how does this task help me fulfill my function? Is it relevant to my function, or is it in fact the subject of another techne? To give you an example, let's stick with medicine. Let's suppose that brain surgeon is encouraged to take up a different practice from what he's usually been doing, and maybe the rationale for doing this is that it will bring in some more money to his practice. But then he has to recognize, actually, well, earning money is is incidental to my techne. It's not actually the function of being a doctor. It's actually another techne. Perhaps that is the techne what we would call misthanica or crematistica, sorry. The art of making money, the art of business. So are the different erga of health, medicine, and business, are they actually compatible? Is one going to hinder the other? These are the kinds of considerations that we need to keep in mind, and keep our central function foremost in mind. So I hope that may be helpful. Now, I'd like to now give you an example, I think, of a passage from an ancient text that I think really does help us to think in more depth about how perhaps the modern professions should be organized. And I think it has a number of suggestions that are important in the modern workplace. Now, the text I have in mind is Plato's Statesman, or Plato's Politicus, to give it its Latin term. Now, just to give you a little bit of background on this text, because not everyone may be familiar with it, it's a late dialogue of Plato, so we're talking towards the middle of the 4th century. We don't know exactly when Plato's dialogues were written, but we know that some are later in his career and some are earlier in his career, roughly. So we can get them in more or less an accepted order of chronology. And with a lot of the late dialogues of Plato, it's perhaps not the sort of dialogue that you're generally used to. For one thing, Socrates does not play a great role in this dialogue, although he is present in the dramatic action. He's listening to the conversation. The main conversation takes place between a stranger who is visiting Athens. We never hear his name. He's just an invention, and he comes from the city of Alea, which is a Greek city, but it's in Italy. And many of you who've studied ancient philosophy will of course know that Alea was very famous for its philosophers, particularly Parmenides and Zeno, not the Zeno who later founded the Stoic school of philosophy, but an earlier but still very prominent philosopher. So of course this stranger coming from Alea is a perfect proxy for Plato and a substitution for Socrates, and in fact he resembles the character of Socrates in many of the other dialogues. And his more junior interlocutor is a young man named Socrates, not the famous philosopher, but another individual of the same name. Now, what is the subject of this dialogue? It is essentially the definition of the politicus, the statesman or the king. Now, politicus is not a standard term like politician. It's not a term that will be used in everyday life. It's actually a philosophical concept of an ideal statesman. The politicians of the ancient world were actually termed rhetores, not politikoi. So this is what is the best form of king or statesman is the politikos. And the conclusion is that the statesman practices a skill or techne, which is termed politike. So you see all these cognates from where we get politics, politician. And this individual manages the other skilled workers who are his assistants within the city-state. So the doctors, for example, in promoting health within the polis, are essentially assisting the politikos. Now, I'd like to focus in on a particular passage towards the end of the dialogue, and the text, I'm not going to read through or discuss the full text in detail because it's quite a long passage, but you'll find it on the handout attached to this paper, and I'll briefly paraphrase it for you as well. Now, this passage concerns the law and the techne. And remember, of course, that the politikos is a technites, so in the same way as a doctor is, or even a carpenter, or a potter, producer of crockery. So they're all technitai. And there are two relationships between the law and the professions proposed here. And this discussion of the relationship between law and the techni comes about because the Eleatic stranger makes a very surprising statement. He says that the politikos will not, in fact, be always bound by the law. He will not always be following the law. Now, this is quite extraordinary because you'll remember, of course, that Socrates, Plato's master and teacher, had insisted in the case after the Battle of Arginusae that he would do nothing contrary to the law. And he held that view, according to Plato, until the end of his life. In fact, in Plato's dialogue, the Crito, we have a discussion where Socrates is offered the opportunity to flee from Athens, to escape his fate, after he had been convicted of corrupting the youth, and sentenced drink hemlock to die by poison. And Socrates refuses to leave Athens because he will not disobey the law. The law was that if he was found guilty, he would have to be executed. So he will obey that, even if it means his own death. So what on earth can this possibly mean? That the king, the politikos, and by extension, so doctors, etc., will not obey the law, always. Well, what we actually have here is a distinction, as I said, between two relationships between the law and professions. And in one, the ideal relationship between the law and professions, the law merely provides a general institutional framework and set of rules which govern the general behavior of technitae, and indeed all citizens within the polis. They do not attempt to manage the work of a professional. So a professional will just act according to his own initiative, act according to what he or she believes to be true, and believes to be beneficial at the time for his client. He doesn't have a set of rules and regulations, but of course has a general sense of good practice with his teachers and through exchanging ideas with peers and other colleagues, but he's never bound by a superior committee or set of managers or regulators. So in this sense, both the statesman and the doctor are the same. The statesman will be able to bend the laws, or at least the laws do not hem him in any way. He actually has a fairly free rein in what he can do within certain parameters set by the law. Now, the second relationship between the law and the professions is one in which lawmakers, and by this, of course, in the modern state, we're thinking of representatives within an assembly, a parliament, but in the ancient world we're thinking of everyone, the whole citizen body, well, not everyone, but all of the enfranchised male citizens. All of those individuals would get together in an assembly, Plato imagines, and actually decide. We do have occasionally some bad doctors or some bad helmsmen, sailors, ships captains. So what we're going to do is we're going to regulate them. We're going to specify exactly how they should carry out their work and force compliance. And in the passage you have on the handout, Plato imagines that in this scenario, anyone who doesn't follow the regulations will be denounced as being not a doctor or a true captain, but some kind of pseudo-intellectual who is corrupting the youth. Of course, the perfect example, the model that Plato is thinking of here is, of course, Socrates, who was condemned for allegedly corrupting the youth, for of course sticking to truth and the pursuit of wisdom at all costs. But that's not what our law makers are interested in. Lawmakers are not interested in truth or in the free investigation of knowledge. What they're concerned with is, here is a rule, follow it, regardless of whether it is actually true or right or useful. So what are the consequences for this second relationship between law and the techni? Well, the younger Socrates concludes at the bottom of that passage on the handout in 299e that in that case clearly all the arts would be utterly ruined, nor could they ever rise again through the operation of the law prohibiting investigation, and so life which is hard enough now would then become absolutely endurable. So we can see in this passage the key principles, the key assumptions that dominate Plato's thought on techne. One of those is that only the technites, only the skilled worker, should be able to comment on that particular skill, techne, so he has complete freedom within the bounds of his area of expertise. Now, of course, the politikos, the statesman, is in a sense managing all of these assistants, all of these different lower forms of technitai, but he isn't telling them how to do their work. He's simply making sure that there's the right balance of different types of experts within the polis. And this is very different to this dystopia that Plato is proposing. And here we can see the other major assumption, that for the techni to be useful, for skills and professions to be useful, beneficial, professionals must be both autonomous and have freedom within their own professions. Otherwise, the techni are completely ruined. Now, what Plato presents in the Statesman, is of course a dystopia. He doesn't actually think that this imagined world exists. But does it exist today? Has Plato's dystopia come about in our modern world? And this is the question I'd like to raise just as we conclude. In the modern world, we've seen a growth in bureaucracy and government, and indeed government interference, that would have been completely unimaginable. Well, it's not unimaginable, but would have been completely ridiculous in the ancient world. Plato has imagined such a world, but he does not think it could ever really be a good outcome, and therefore he does not really believe it would exist. But nonetheless, it has come into existence. And the questions I'd like to finish here, the Heterodox Academy, of course, is about promoting discussion, so I don't intend at this point to give definite answers, but hopefully raise questions so that they can be discussed, is whether this is a good thing. We have a situation where increasingly professionals are not autonomous. They are being managed by people who are setting guidelines and best practice and policies that have to be followed. Now, of course, it may be that we still have freedom of speech. Professionals can, of course, say that these guidelines and best practices are misguided or wrong, but do we have autonomy? Do we have the ability to change these rules and guidance? And if we do not, for how long will free speech continue, or is there even a point to it? Should we just shut up and simply do what our managers tell us? Are the functions of professionals, erga, in fact, now being decided by government and managers? What is a university's function? Is it education and research, or is it something else? Could it be promoting social mobility, for example, or promoting diversity and inclusion, or preventing terrorism, or even providing an education which used to be provided by school teachers? All of these are possibilities, and again, I don't make any want to provide have a more focused idea of what our function is, and try and cut out work that is not beneficial to that function. And incidentally, if you want to have a suggestion for a good piece of reading on the growth of bureaucracy in the professions, I'd recommend especially the book that's on the screen, Bullshit Jobs, a very provocative title indeed, by David Graeber. As I say, I want to conclude there by just hopefully suggesting how an ancient text, Plato's Statesman, does actually raise an awful lot of questions for us in the modern world, and thinking about how we work today, and what I would call the politics of work. And I've hopefully shown you, I hope I've inspired you to think in more detail about what might have seemed a rather boring, but is actually a very important and I hope very stimulating area, which is the field of work in which we all variously toil for 5 days a week. And with that, I'd just like to thank you very much for listening in. Do feel free to add comments below and questions, and do also have a look at the handout and the bibliography I provided on there. Well, thank you very much, and do keep in touch. Goodbye.